Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some really interesting repertoire that's rather accessible and easy to get your hands on, and you probably haven't heard most of it. It is this disc on the Regis label of interesting and unusual chamber music by Glinka. Now, nobody knows very much about Glinka here in the West, but he was a fascinating character. I read his biography, which was all about how he caught gonorrhea and whatnot. It's very exciting. In Spain, by the way, probably. Anyway, the bottom line is this. Glinka was such a seminal figure in the development of Russian music, and we only know him from a couple of things. We know him from the overture to Ruslan and Ludmila, and we know him from sometimes his Spanish Spaniture, yes, the Spaniture, his Spanish overture number 1, about, that's based on the Jota Aragonesa. Da 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 dum, da 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 da, which you may also recognize as the post-horn solo in Mahler's Third Symphony in the Scherzo, or from Liszt's Spanish Rhapsody, or a million other works that use the same tune. But Glinka was actually, he wasn't exactly prolific. He was actually kind of lazy, and he only lived to be 51. And he wrote 2 operas, right? A Life for the Tsar, and Ruslan and Ludmila, and then a tiny, tiny handful of orchestral works, including that Spanish overture and Kamarinskaya and a couple other things that were, some of the first works to actually use Russian folk music. And from this came this enormous school of Russian music. But what made him even more interesting to me, and this is because of my obsession, was the fact that Glinka was a vibrato guy. In other words, he's one of the earliest composers we have who actually notated vibrato in his scores. He was exceptionally detailed in his notation, really remarkably so, and he set up the whole Russian school for that as well. His choice of instruments, his orchestration, all of those preferences were later subsumed into, the Russian school that studied him, from Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky on up. I mean, all of those people. They knew their Glinka. And what makes him so interesting about that is because he studied in Italy, in Milan specifically, and he knew all the bel canto opera composers, and that was the basis of his art. And so we really know something about, the way that orchestras probably played in the early decades of the 19th century, because Glinka's dates were 1804 to 1857. So he was only 53 when he died. And he barely made it into the second half of the 19th century. Most of his works were contemporary with late Beethoven and Schubert and those people. And we don't think of him that way at all. We think of him as an out-and-out early romantic because, I guess he was. I suppose he was, but there was a lot in his music that was extremely progressive. And these chamber works are really, really fascinating. There are 4 of them on this particular disc. And I'm just going to tell you what they are and then turn you loose to enjoy them because they are splendid and fun to listen to. First, there is his septet in E-flat major for oboe, bassoon, horn, 2 violins, cello, and double bass. No viola. I mean, septets from this period were quite famous. This was composed in 1823. Remember, Beethoven still was up and running in 1823. Schubert was up and running in 1823, and so was Glinka. Rossini was going like crazy. Who thinks of Glinka in that company? But he was. He really was. Yes, he was young. He was, 19 or something when he wrote this, but still. There he was, Beethoven's septet and Spohr's septet and all these. Berwald wrote one. I mean, septets and nonettes and things like that were really, really popular. These sort of serenade-like chamber pieces. And so Glinka's is part of that tradition. And it's a beautiful work, a lovely work. Derivative, yeah, okay, a little bit. But so what? I mean, he was really a gifted guy. Then next, these next two pieces are just fabulous. There's the Serenade on themes from Donizetti's opera Anna Bolena, which is just wonderful. First of all, it's 20 minutes long. It's a big work in one movement. And it's scored for piano, harp, bassoon, horn, viola, cello, and double bass. And this comes from 1832. So he was fully mature, and it's around his Italian period. And he knew all these people, and he knew all these operas. And it's absolutely beautiful. It's one of the, operatic, pieces based on these opera potpourri type things, like all the piano works of Liszt and Thalberg and those people. They were a dime a dozen. But these big chamber pieces are a little bit more special and absolutely fascinating and delicious. And the performances here, by the way, are wonderful. The performances feature the Russian National Symphony Orchestra soloists under Mikhail Pletnev, who is the pianist and sort of leading the thing. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. Then we've got the Divertimento Brilliant, the brilliant Divertimento on themes from Bellini's La Sonnambula, which dates from the same year as the Serenade. It's about 13 minutes long in one movement, and it is a Divertimento, and it is brilliant. And what's not to love? It's just acres and acres of gorgeous bel canto tunes, fetchingly arranged. And, this is great road music, by the way. Put it on in your car and just relax and enjoy it. It's just so much fun. And finally, his grand sextet in E-flat major. This is also from 1832. All of these things were written sort of during his Italian sojourn. And that's for piano, string quartet, and double bass, which is a rather more normal ensemble. And these are his major chamber works. There are some others. There are a couple others. But basically, if you've got that little bit of orchestral music and the two operas and this stuff, and then there are a bunch of songs or romances that he wrote, that's his output. That's really basically the whole shebangy. And, because he was, like I said, somewhat lazy. But the other thing is that he was the quintessential big fish in a small pond. Because all of the composers who were performed in Russia in the first half of the 19th century, they were the Italians. It was an Italian opera place. That's what the court wanted to hear. Everything had to be done at the, whim of the Tsar or the nobility. And there wasn't a big market for, Russian stuff based on Russian themes. And Glinka was slowly demonstrating that Russian composers could be as good as the other guys. And that's why he was so significant, in the history of Russian music, basically. But these are delightful works. And I just want to tell you about them and then ask you to listen, because you're going to have a really good time, especially the things based on the Donizetti and Bellini themes. Those are really, really fun. And they're contemporary with the actual works, basically, which is what makes them even more interesting. So let's see if we can find a place for Glinka in our pantheon in the history of Western music in the actual period in which he worked. It's a wonderful, wonderful story and a terrific sort of musicological exploration. He really needs to be taken seriously by Western musicologists, particularly as regards his attitude toward notation and his specificity in these and many, many other works. It's really, really interesting to look at his scores. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about listening to his actual music. So keep on listening, friends, and thanks so much for joining me. This, by the way, is on Regis. Which means it's licensed and it's just easy to get and inexpensive. So what could be bad? Take care.